Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Google Ads API webinar on roadmap and migration. My name is Adam Oren. I'm a developer advocate for the Google Ads API based in Singapore, live streaming to you. It is 9 p.m. here in Singapore. And good morning to those in the East Coast of the United States, and where everybody else in Europe, and where the rest of your day is. Good early afternoon, and whatever it is where you're tuning in from. Okay, we're just about to get started here, so thank you all for tuning in. Before we get started, just want to take the time to mention that this is a third webinar that we have for our Google Ads API in an ongoing series. You may have joined us for our previous two webinars, most notably about 5 or 6 months ago in May. We had an introductory webinar when we first released the beta of the Google Ads API. That introduced the beta program and the initial concept of the Google Ads API beta to you. Since then, we also had a more specialized Google Ads API webinar on hotel ads. If you're not into hotel ads, don't worry, you may not have known about it. This was specialized to our partners that use the hotel ads features of the API and what the Google Ads API migration meant in that context. So today is our third webinar in this sort of ongoing series of webinars about the Google Ads API. And today we're going to focus a little bit on roadmap and migration. So what is going on with the Google Ads API vis-a-vis the AdWords API? What does our roadmap look like for going into 2019 for both of these APIs? And we're also going to touch a little bit on migration strategy. We do have some announcements here that we're going to be giving to you live in this webinar about sort of our forward-looking plan for both of these APIs and how you should approach a migration. So we're excited that everybody could join this webinar, get this information. So right before we get started, just a quick little bit of housekeeping about the Q&A. If you're on the YouTube chat, you'll notice about 20 minutes ago, I pasted a link in there to the Q&A. It's also at the top of the screen. Basically, this is how we're going to do Q&A for the live stream of this webinar. If you have any questions at any time about anything, write them into this form, and we will get to them towards the end when we do a Q&A session. We'll just literally go through the laundry list of questions and make sure that we get everybody's question answered. You'll notice there's a whole bunch of questions in there already with the pre-prefix. When we announced the webinar, we provided a form to everybody to sort of give us your questions ahead of time so we can put them in this form and make sure we get any questions that you had burning before you came in here answered. So if you see any questions that are there already that you really like, be sure to upvote them, because I'll sort them sort of by the number of upvotes they have and thumbs up that they have, and we'll answer in that order. So yeah, that's how the questions are going to work. So let's get started with the agenda. So what we're going to cover, I'm going to show you a little bit about the overview. Then we're going to talk about the updates and an API roadmap. So I can talk a little bit about what's going on with the API, where we've been and where we're going. Kind of touch a little bit on a couple of new features. And then finally, we are going to talk about the migration, talk about some migration strategies and some Q&A. So hold on one second. Give me 1 second. I heard that there's no video. Are you guys not seeing any video? Can anybody see the screen share or not? If you could type in to the chat to let me know. Anybody having trouble seeing slides, or is it just my voice? Well, I want to make sure we don't have any issues with the presentation before we go any forward here. No video. There's no video. Okay. So give me 1 second. Let me see if I can figure out what's going on here. Okay, great. Thanks. Hold on 1 second, guys. Let me see if I can get this going, and then we will start all over again if we can sort this out. Okay. Stop and try presenting again. Okay, so if you can hear my voice now, I'm going to restart the screen share to see if that fixes the screen, to see if anybody. Okay, give me 1 sec. Did that change anything? Does anybody anything now? Can we see any video yet? Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Thank you guys for letting me know. That would have been pretty embarrassing to go through this and you couldn't be able to see anything. Okie doke. So let's get back on track here. um, just going back real quick. Um, just real quick. The Q&A housekeeping. This is the screen it looks like. There's a link at the top. Hopefully it's working. You can see the agenda now. We've got overview. We've got the updates in the API roadmap, new features, migration, and Q&A. I'm going to go forward to the overview slides. Everybody see something nice, big and blue right now? Just give me a thumbs up in the chat. Just want to make sure that as we go through them, we didn't get stuck again. Okie doke. Cool. All right, here we go. So let's pretend we're starting again. Overview. The next generation of the AdWords API is here. So if you tuned into our previous webinar, you may have noticed that this is a little bit of a variation on a theme. The last webinar presented the opening with the next generation of the AdWords API is on its way. So the variation, and I think the thing that we want you to take away, if you get anything out of this webinar, is the Google Ads API beta is here. The skeleton is fully fleshed out. We have most of our core functionality implemented, even though a lot of it may not be 100%. We may not have feature parity with a whole bunch of other things, and we may not be 100% deployed to go to production yet. What you see is mostly what you're going to get. So now's the time to start planning. The functionality exists that you're going to get, and now's the time to actually start your planning because we have a full sort of flavor of what this API is going to look like. Okay. So not to belabor some of the points that we had in the previous webinar, I don't want to get into the guts of the API, but just sort of like the top line selling points of the new API. Why are we doing this? Why are we introducing a new Google Ads API to replace the existing AdWords API? So first of all, it allows us to innovate our ads platform. And that allows us to do a lot of cool things that we've sort of felt a little bit beholden and held back with the old API for. First of all, we're going to be able to start rolling out new features faster to you. Well, this new API allows us to have quicker updates to our client libraries because it's based on a much more modern API infrastructure. SOAP is going away, and we're going to be building this API on some of our modern cloud paradigms, cloud infrastructure, and the newest technologies to put it as a first-class citizen in the Google API ecosystem. And because of that, it'll have better upward compatibility with changes coming along the way. We won't necessarily need to update and roll new SOAP client libraries and namespace changes all the time. We can introduce non-breaking changes in an incremental fashion so we can get features to you faster. This will also increase developer productivity. So the other flip side of this is it's better for us, and it's a good system all around. You'll find working with our new API, and this is something that I think we sort of hammered home in the last webinar as well, it'll have unified retrieval of entities and stats. So we've sort of gone away with the existing legacy infrastructure in the AdWords API where you have sort of two different APIs. There's a SOAP API for manipulating objects, right? And then you have the reporting APIs. Well, that's sort of going away now. We have a unified way where you send us SQL-like statements. So it looks a lot like SQL that you would use at the database, and you can pull entities and stats down from the API to you in a unified way. So we don't necessarily have two separate types of APIs. It's a single API. And so we think that's going to vastly increase developer productivity because it's going to allow you to do things in a much more uniform fashion across the client libraries and across the SDK that you work with. That has to do with this easy and powerful query language. It's called the Google Ads query language. It looks a lot like SQL. We have some slides coming up a little bit later in the talk. We'll talk a little bit more about it. And most importantly, the API is now consistent with Google's latest standards. So if you're integrating with some of our other cloud APIs, if you're trying to use some of the latest machine learning APIs, things like that, the Google Ads API is on the same stack. You're not sort of dealing with the ugly duckling of SOAP in your code and having to figure out how to integrate that code base with some of the other REST APIs that are out there in the rest of the Google ecosystem. This fits in nicely with a lot of our other products and a lot of our other developer APIs. So in that respect, it's going to lead, we think it's going to lead to a fairly substantial increase in your productivity as developers. So why is that? What does it look like underneath the hood? So the first major thing is the modern API architecture. So the new Google Ads API is based on both gRPC and JSON REST. How can it be both at the same time? Well, that's interesting. We're going to get that in a slide. It's actually, we have two sort of separate facades and endpoints to the same underlying API. You can either use gRPC or JSON REST. You can interact with the API in both ways. And this is also consistent with our Cloud API design doc. So this, like I said, it puts it in the same class of API as a lot of our other Google APIs that are out there in the cloud environment. The unified data model supporting the complex queries I mentioned with the Google Ads query language will enable the data to come back to you in a consistent, reliable fashion. And also we have scalable data downloads now. So we've sort of re-architected how we send data back to you from the API. So if you've been using the Google Ads API, the AdWords API, excuse me, for a while, you know that it can become pretty dicey when you try to retrieve large data sets. When you try to download lots of data, maybe for really large accounts or many millions of keywords or something like that in a report, you have all sorts of things you can contend with, like data timeouts, deadline exceeded errors that could occur on our side. So we've re-architected how we stream this data to you in sort of a server-side cache, and you could page sort of arbitrarily large data sets back to you in a consistent way. So we've really taken the time to work on the scalability of the amount of data that this API can handle. Okay, so a single API with two protocols. This is what I was going at. We have a single Google Ads API backend service that's exposed in two different ways. We have gRPC, which is Google's high-performance protocol buffers over HTTP2 that you can use. And you get that when you use our client libraries. Or if you don't want to use our client libraries, or for whatever reason you want to use a RESTful approach, you can do that as well. So you can actually have two choices of how you interact with this API. We strongly recommend using our client libraries if you can. We have Java, .NET, PHP, Python, and Ruby released now. We're looking into expanding this in the future. So this is definitely not set in stone. There definitely could be further client library languages in the future. But the thing I want to point out to you is on the right. This is an actual example. Sure, I took out some of the authorization token, developer token, stuff like that, redacted some things. But this is an actual request on how you can interact with this API, the Google Ads API, using the command line in curl. So it is a RESTful API. You can issue an HTTP request to it, and you get JSON responses back. And this is exactly the same thing, functionally speaking, as if you're using the gRPC with our client libraries. It's just two different protocols. So you can interact with the API in two different ways. Okay, so I don't want to get too stuck in the weeds. That's sort of the brief whirlwind tour, the introduction of what the Google Ads API is, the sort of key headline features behind it. I think the main reason a lot of people are here today is sort of updates about the API, where we're headed with the roadmap. So just before we look forward to where we're going, I kind of want to just give you a quick review of where we've come from. So on April 23rd, we released the first version of this Google Ads API beta. That's sort of the V0. That was shortly after version 2018.02 of the AdWords API. We then released 2018.06 and 2018.09 of the AdWords API. And right around that same time, once 2018.09 was out the door, we started iterating more significantly on the Google Ads API and brought you V04, V05, and just last week, V06 of the Google Ads API. The reason I want to bring this up is we did pass a couple significant milestones, for example, since the last time we had this first webinar. The first thing I want to bring to attention is in V04, we removed the whitelist for the Google Ads API beta. So what that means is you don't necessarily need to sign up. All you have to do is have a developer token like you have with our normal AdWords API. You create your project in the developer console, and you can start using this API without any whitelisting or having to be on any special list. The second major thing that last week, and one of the major reasons that we wanted to do this webinar today, is we implemented the core set of RMF features. So if you're not familiar with what the RMF is, that stands for Required Minimum Functionality. And that is sort of what we consider, if you're implementing a full-scale ads management platform, the RMF is sort of the MVP, minimum viable product list of features that we want you to implement to make sure that your customers using your platform can interact with Google Ads system and have all the controls and optimizations that they need to be successful. So this is critical because we've taken that list and we've implemented the core feature set there. We may not be at 100% parity, and some things may not be 100% done. This still is a beta, but the core of that list and the core of that functionality is there. So that's really what prompted us to hit this milestone and want to bring this webinar and sort of get this information to you, because sort of the core features are there and the core functionality is finally in the Google Ads API. So when we started with V0, just to reiterate how this has panned out a little bit and where we are, we started with the core features, right? We had basic campaign management. Maybe you can add some ad groups and some keywords bids. It was pretty basic. Since that time, when we released V04, V05, we had some incremental updates, added some functionality, but V06, just last week, is what really stood apart. That added sort of the bulk of the core functionality vis-a-vis this required minimum functionality, or RMF feature set, to the Google Ads API. And as we roll forward and get closer to the V1.0, or the production release of the API, we do expect to hit full feature parity with both the RMF and the existing AdWords API, along with having some new features in the API. And obviously, when we release it out the door, it will be production ready. But where we are right now is this RMF feature set. So that includes a lot of things, from account management to different ad formats, ability to work with audiences, conversions, keyword planning, wide support for mutate, support shopping, a whole bunch of things. So if you want to get a little bit more information on the RMF, if you don't know what it is, you want to get that laundry list of things to understand exactly what we targeted to get into this API. You can look in the AdWords API, so the legacy AdWords API developer site, at this link here, and that'll give you an idea of sort of the core feature set that we strive to implement here. Okay, so that's where we are, and that's what we have in the API now. So now I think it's time to sort of pivot and take a look at 2019, and this is where things get really interesting, and I think we have a couple announcements here that I think are a little bit new that will help you to start planning for the road ahead. So the first thing that we want to announce today is that we are targeting to have version 1.0 of the Google Ads API released in Q1 of 2019. We're not putting a specific date on it, but this will likely be sort of towards the beginning of Q1, maybe the end of January, beginning of February. But Q1 is definitely when we're targeting to have version 1.0 of the Google Ads API in production. So that's sort of the first big takeaway that we want to impress upon you here. The second thing, and because of that, and the writing may have been on the wall for a little while, but we're sort of ready to make it official, is version 2018-09 of the AdWords API was the final release of the AdWords API. We do not plan to have any more numbered versions. There's not going to be 2019-02, 2019-06. 2018-09 is the final version that we're planning for the the AdWords API, excuse me. And all new features going forward, and all of our sort of work is kind of sort of tack a little bit and focus on the Google Ads API. And because of that, sort of the consequence of all this is the AdWords API will sunset. And we're looking to sunset the AdWords API 1 year after the version 1.0 of the Google Ads API is released. So if we release if we do wind up releasing the Google Ads API version 1 on time in Q1 of 2019, you can look for a sunset of the AdWords API in likely Q1 of 2020, so plus 1 year from that date. So that's sort of the third major piece of information that we want to give everybody. So you're going to have a 1 year migration period, and the clock will start ticking on the countdown to that sunset for the AdWords API once we release the version 1.0 in Q1 of 2019. So just to reiterate, the key takeaways from the roadmap and the slides that we just presented here, that version 2018-09 was the final release of the AdWords API, and no new feature development is planned on that branch. All of our efforts are going to go into releasing new features and new functionality into the Google Ads API. But important point is both the AdWords API and the Google Ads API will coexist in 2019, and not just coexist, they can actually be used simultaneously in the same code base and in the same process. So you can actually have both of these client libraries installed in your code, running side by side, and be making common requests to both APIs in the same environment, and things will just work. In fact, this is how we expect most people to migrate to the Google Ads APIs, to do it in pieces. Adopt new features that you like, plan on migrating small units of functionality in your code. don't do it all at once. Don't try to bite off an entire code base and migrate it at once. Take advantage of the fact that both of these things work side by side. And the AdWords API, like I said, will sunset approximately 1 year after Google Ads API release is version 1.0 in Q1 of 2019. And finally, existing and new development should plan to use the Google Ads API. Exactly what that means for you is a little bit subjective, right? If you're targeting, if you have some existing software development, you're planning to release something early in Q1, maybe before January, and you've already started implementing things in the AdWords API, please continue to do so. Don't try to switch mid-game, especially if you've had a midstream, especially if you have a whole bunch of code written already. Get that out the door, get it up and running, get whatever you're working on to 1.0, and then focus on a migration. The key thing to notice, though, is looking forward, if you have some software development efforts coming up, especially if they're going to coincide with the Q1 of 2019 timeframe, please, please, please start looking at the Google Ads API and see if it's appropriate for you to start actually writing code and prototyping code in that environment and being prepared to release into that environment, so you don't have to unnecessarily migrate your code from the AdWords API to the Google Ads API if you don't have to. Okay, so that's sort of the roadmap. That's where we are. That's where we're going. Before I go into sort of the migration stuff, I want to just give you a little bit of a tour of some of the new features that we're bringing to the Google Ads API. At least get the juices flowing, get you a little bit excited about some of the things that we're working on, and just sort of emphasize some of the key new features of the Google Ads API. One of the first things that we keep hitting on this, I know, but it's really important, and we think it's really one of the sort of centerpieces of the new API is how you fetch data with the Google Ads query language. So this is our unified data fetching model that we keep talking about. It's a SQL-like language for fetching data from the API. It applies to both metrics, if you're trying to get impressions, clicks, costs, stats for things, and also to things like campaigns, ad groups, keywords. And one of the things it does is it also allows you to do seamless data joins between related entities. What does that mean? So say I'm trying to get information for impressions, clicks, and costs for keywords. I can walk up the AdWords, or the Google Ads, hierarchy and get the associated ad groups, the campaigns, the associated customer data, associated with whatever more granular level of information I'm looking at. So just to sort of give you an example, on the right side of the screen, this is sort of a JSON response that comes back if you're querying the Google Ads API. And this is for what we call the keyword view. So this is getting keyword level metrics, clicks, impressions, cost, things like that for keywords, which are in the parlance of the API are called ad group criteria. But you'll notice in the response, there's also an ad group and campaign object in that response. That's because keywords are contained in an ad group and an ad group is contained in a campaign. So when you make a request to the API, you can sort of unnest that doll of hierarchical data and fetch sort of the entire object hierarchy together in one go. So looking at a more concrete example of sort of the query that you could use to generate this sort of response. And so this example here is in Python. It's a Python snippet that shows how to issue a Google Ads query language and get the response back from the Google Ads API. So again, notice it looks a lot like SQL. That is very intentional. So you start to select things like the keyword text, ad group name, campaign name, metrics, and all the related entities are sort of joined together seamlessly. All you have to do is select them, and you get rows of objects back that look like what's across the bottom of the screen here. So the metrics object encapsulates the actual data that you're trying to get, click, CTR, impressions, but you also get the ad group criteria, the ad group, and the campaign object associated with this request, simply by including those fields in the select statement. And one of the things to notice about this is these objects are actual first class like campaign, ad group, or ad group criterion objects. This isn't like the old AdWords API where you downloaded sort of a tabular data tabular file of CSV data, and then if you wanted to say take this Google Ads developer blog campaign that's mentioned here and set its status to paused, you wouldn't have to reconstruct a SOAP object on your side. You could instead fetch this object with the status embedded in it. When you get it back from this API call, literally just set its status to either enabled or paused, whatever you want to change, and send it right back to the API, to the campaign service in the API, and you can mutate this object directly. This is a first-class citizen. in the API. So this is sort of what we're talking about by being able to fetch metrics and objects together. And you'll see in some of the examples in the next few slides how this isn't limited to just reporting. This is the same query language, the same sort of fetch mechanism is how you retrieve things like recommendations, change status, the things we're going to be talking about in a few slides here. Okay, before I get to those, another thing that we want to mention, it's sort of new to the Google Ads API, is explicit manager account authentication. So what this is we're giving you the ability to define which manager account you're logged in as when you log into the API as a manager account and operate on client accounts. What this does, the reason that we're doing this is it avoids ambiguous access semantics for some sensitive operations that you can do with the API. And so looking at sort of this diagram that's on the right-hand side of the screen here, this is a relatively new concept. If you've been using the Google Ads for a long time, sometime in the past year or two, past few years, we added the ability to be able to take a Google account and associate it with more than one Google Ads account. And so that had the side effect that you could have a Google account that, for example, can have access to both a global manager account and some sort of intermediate or sub-manager account underneath it. And if that ever happened, you sort of have ambiguous access semantics. So sure, you have credentials to be logged in as the root and access everything in this account hierarchy, but maybe that's not what you meant. Maybe you only had access to the sub account, this intermediate manager account, and then sometime later a different level of account access was added. So it's not necessarily explicit what you intended to do or who you intended to be logged in as. Compare this to, for example, the Google Ads user interface. When you log into the manager account interface, you're always logged in with as someone, right? In the upper left-hand corner of the Google Ads UI, it always shows you which manager account you're logged in as. So that's sort of a key distinction, where the Google Ads UI sort of prevents it from being ambiguous. You always know who you're logged in as. So we're adding that ability, that same sort of functionality to the Google Ads API. So just going to walk you through just a quick example of what it means. I think a picture and a diagram speaks for 1,000 words in this case, right? So say you have your API user gmail.com Google account. It's connected to a global manager account at the top of the hierarchy. That's not ambiguous, right? You only have one level of access. You have access to one Google Ads account. If you try to do operations like maybe change billing or manipulate manager account links for these client accounts, anything that involves on manager account access, you should have access to the entire sort of account hierarchy. That makes sense. Likewise, if this user was only connected to, say, in this example, like one of the regional manager accounts, right? You had a Western region manager account and an Eastern region. It was connected to the Eastern region. Well, that makes sense that you should only be able to access and manipulate accounts in that Eastern regional account. You shouldn't be able to do things in the global manager account, nor sort of in this diagram affect things like client account 1, client account 2. But where this becomes ambiguous, where this gets confusing, is what if this happened? What if somehow somebody invited with admin access the Google Ads account to have access to both the global manager account and one of the regional accounts? So in this case, it's not necessarily clear who you meant to be logged in as. And without providing a mechanism to specify that, we have no way to know that either. So that's exactly what we're providing. We're introducing this new header to the Google Ads API request that you make called login customer ID. And you can think of this as sort of analogous to the regular customer ID that you need to send with every Google Ads API request that allows you to identify which account you're targeting. So this is analogous to that, but instead of which account you're targeting, this is identifying which manager account you're logged in as. And now this is an example in the Java programming environment with ads.property and the Java snippet of source code, but we have similar mechanisms for setting this in all our client libraries. You can either set it once and forget it in a properties or config file. Like on the top here, you can set login customer ID equals a certain value, or if you plan on changing that and having it set dynamically, you can use you can actually set it in code. So you can create a Google Ads client builder in your code. The same way you can set like your credentials, your developer token, the client customer ID. You can also now set the login customer ID. And when you do that, that makes it explicit who you intended to log in as. So if you are in this situation, you use the set login customer ID method or set the property. It locks you into this login customer ID, and it's no longer ambiguous, even if you have access to the entire tree through the global manager account, we know that this is what you meant to do. And so in order to change that, you would have to explicitly set the login customer ID to something else. So in this way, we make the login semantics of who you're trying to log in as with the API concrete and non-ambiguous. Okay, so moving on to one of the third new features here that we wanted to bring up is the recommendation service. This one we think is pretty neat. People have been asking for this for a bit, and this is something that we've been able to bring to you in the new Google Ads API. So this is analogous to the recommendation screen that's in the Google Ads user interface. So if you're not familiar, the Google Ads UI has a recommendation screen where it can suggest things like new keywords to target, new ad creatives to add to your account, new bidding strategies to adopt in order to optimize your Google Ads account. And so what we're doing is we're exposing this functionality to users of the API as well. So with this service, you're able to fetch all available optimization recommendations that are available. You can filter to certain subsets that you're interested in. If you're only interested in adopting certain keywords or only just interested in adopting ad suggestions, you can specify that. And you can also programmatically apply or dismiss recommendations as well. So it's not like you have to read this recommendation and craft some sort of request to figure out how to implement it yourself, just like you can click apply in the user interface. Similarly, there are API actions where you can click apply. So what this looks like, again, so this is now a Ruby snippet, again, showing you just the different ways that you can call the API, and even though they look a little bit different in different client languages, they do look the same in a lot of respects. And again, here the Google Ads query language is front and center. The same way you would use it to fetch things like metrics, impressions, clicks, and cost, you use it to fetch things like recommendations. So this is what the query would look like to fetch the recommendations. Notice that you can use a where clause just like you would in any other SQL-like filtering to filter, for example, on the recommendation type that you're interested in. So the beta right now supports these recommendation types. So we have ones for ad suggestions, keywords, adopting different bid strategies. We are planning to expand this pretty significantly. This is what we support now. This is by no means a static list and by no means the only recommendations that we're planning on supporting. We're going to be adding to this pretty substantially. And so just to give you an idea of what this looks like once you get a response back, this is now in JSON what it looks like when you actually get recommendation objects back. For example, if you were like the query there suggested, if you were filtering for keyword recommendations, you get the keyword, you get the match type, and a recommended CPC. And as part of the identifier for the recommendations, each sort of has this token or identifier that you can use to pass to one of the actions on the service, either apply recommendation or dismiss recommendation, to either apply or dismiss the recommendation respectively. And if you do that, for example, the top one will add that broad match keyword to the campaign in question. And if you dismiss the one on the bottom, that's equivalent to dismissing it in the Google Ads UI. So the next time you cycle through and try to get available recommendations, you can filter out the ones that have been dismissed already, so you don't see the ones that you've already accepted or dismissed over and over again. So you only get new ones. Okay, another one here is the change status service. That's another new feature that I know a lot of people have been looking for over the years. We're revamping the change notification mechanism to be more in line with essentially the change history in the Google Ads UI. So the change history is a way to know what has changed in a Google Ads account in a certain period of time. We're opening up this change status service to give you access to that change history. It allows you in its current form to identify which objects were either added, changed, or removed over a given time period that you specify. This is another area where we are significantly looking to expand this to more granular pieces of information. We're looking to see if we can expand what values have been changed and other more useful pieces of information to you in this context. So please look for this to expand in functionality over time. But what this looks like right now, again, the Google Ads query language, you craft a request like this, select all these things from change status, where, for example, in this case, change date time was during the last 7 days. So this looks at the last 7 days and gets all the changes that occurred in the account. And when you do that, you get a list of change objects. There's just an example of one of them looked like, but it obviously would be a whole list of them that you would get back. You get the last change date time. You get a timestamp when it occurred, what it was, an ad group, the campaign that it's associated with, and the resource status change. So this is the thing that could either have been added or removed to indicate that this is a brand new ad group, or if it was a removed ad group. But in this case, the status has changed indicating that this is an existing ad group and one of its properties changed. Again, right now we don't necessarily expose what value has changed, but that is something we're looking to expose in the future. So look for more granular information about these changes to be exposed in a future version of the API. So we're working hard to improve this and build this out, but this is sort of a taste of and a flavor of what this change status service is going to look like. Okay, so that touches on, I think, some of the cool and exciting things that we're bringing to you in the Google Ads API that are a little bit different from the AdWords API. And now I want to get into sort of some broad migration strategies and how we're expecting people to approach a migration and give you some pointers. It's not necessarily how exactly to change your code. We're not going to walk through code examples, but we're going to instead talk about the more general strategy that you should adopt and how we think people would be best suited to approach this problem of trying to migrate a big code base from one API to the other. So it's guided around sort of 3 different principles. First one, plan early. We want you to start planning now. That's one of the reasons we're doing the webinar. That's one of the reasons we've got all this RMF functionality into the API beta as soon as we could. We want to give you enough information so you can actually start planning. Now's the time to start planning, even if you're not going to start implementing or writing code imminently, especially with the holidays coming up. Now is the time to start planning and thinking about this. Second sort of tenet here is to scope generously. Whatever you're planning, whatever you're thinking, add a little bit more time. This is not necessarily going to be a trivial migration. This is not like going from one version of the AdWords API to the next, like 2018-02 to 2018-06. This is going to involve a little bit more effort. So please scope a little bit more time than you otherwise would. And finally, divide and conquer. This sort of goes back to what I mentioned a little bit earlier, is you can use both the AdWords API and the Google Ads API simultaneously in the same process, and we expect people to do that. Don't try to do this all at once. Whether that's migrating pieces or adopting new features piecewise, you can do either. For example, if you wanted to add recommendations to your existing project, it's fine to start adopting and playing with the recommendation service in the Google Ads API beta while still leaving the rest of your code base using the AdWords API. So mix and match the 2 APIs together to start working on this in a divided and piecewise approach. So again, what are the key tasks involved, like planning, scoping, coding, to get you from the AdWords API to the Google Ads API? So in the planning stage, again, this is what you can be doing now. We want you to start getting familiar with the documentation, understanding the technology and the key differences between the AdWords API and what the Google Ads API has to offer. So understand Google Ads query language, understand how the differences in how you fetch objects may affect your code base, and start prototyping with the example code. You'll notice on GitHub we have a lot of examples. We're trying to maintain a one-to-one mapping of, where possible, of our old AdWords API code examples to our new Google Ads API code examples. So you have literally code samples that you can diff left and right and see what changed, how they change, what is different about them. So start working with these resources to start planning this migration as soon as possible. It's something that you start doing right away. Once you have sort of a little bit of a plan and an idea, then we want to start scoping, right? You want to start assigning resources, estimating the time and effort it's going to take. Once you understand what's going to be changing, then you can have a better idea of how long and how much time and how much effort it's going to take to do that. And like I said, scope generously. The third thing here, just go back and add whatever you've planned on, go back and add a little bit extra time, bump the numbers up by 20%. Give yourself more time than you think you need, because you are going to run into things that may be a little bit different and may require a little bit more time than you initially planned. You don't want necessarily, I don't want that to necessarily derail your plans and cause you more heartache than it should. And then finally, once you've scoped everything out, you understand what you're doing, you have a battle plan, code. And do this again in pieces. Define bite-sized units of work. Don't try to migrate your entire code base all at once. Instead, migrate logical groups of services together. So a concrete example is, for example, our ad campaigns. So if you go into the code samples, one of our basic examples in all the client libraries is how to add a campaign to an existing Google Ads account. So if you look at that, it involves 2 services: the campaign service for actually creating the campaign itself, and the budget service for setting a daily budget. You have to use both together. So find the groups of services like that work together, the campaign service, the budget service. Define a logical group of work like creating a campaign or something, and move that logical piece of code together. So move things piecewise in sort of logical groups of services like that. And you can do that while still leaving other sections of your code running on the AdWords API and not migrated. Things will work as they should, because both APIs can be used together during this transition. And that's sort of how we expect people to plan this migration and move from one API to the other. So again, a little bit just sort of put into a diagram here what we're talking about with this divide and conquer approach. Now, say you had a software stack that had, this is just an example, okay? So say you had 4 different components. You had account creation, you did some campaign management, you had budget optimization and reporting. So divide those functional pieces into those groups of services. So the account creation services, campaign management services, budget optimization, and the reporting services that you use, and then migrate them piece by piece. So for example, in this example, say you wanted to migrate the campaign management, again, so like say the campaign service and the budget service, and some of your reporting statements. So migrate from using the AdWords API reports to start using the Google Ads search service to pull down the Google Ads query language versions of those reports. You can migrate those 2 components, get those running on the Google Ads API, while your account creation code and bid optimization code still runs on the AdWords API. One key thing to notice while you do this, don't just blindly migrate things over, look for ways to optimize. Again, going back to sort of the key talking points I mentioned at the beginning, the key selling points, we expect developer productivity to go up. And what we mean by that is there are going to be good opportunities when you make this migration to eliminate, for example, redundant round-trip API calls because of the unified way that objects and metrics are retrieved together. You may not necessarily need to make one API call to get a whole bunch of reporting data, translate that into SOAP data, send that back to the SOAP endpoints. You can likely do some filtering server-side with the more complex where clauses supported by the Google Ads query language and manipulate the objects that you get back directly. So we expect this migration to eliminate some redundant round-trip API calls. And on top of that, on the client code footprint itself, the way that our client libraries are being generated, they're from protocol buffers using an idiomatic generation process. So the client libraries are being generated in a way that is much more efficient than what we were using with our SOAP and Access pipeline to generate the AdWords API client libraries. And a concrete example of this, again, this is going to vary by the client language significantly, but for our Java programming language, we noticed that it's up to 25% less code required in the code examples when we translated them from the AdWords API to the Google Ads API, just owing to how the code generation works, the idiomatic use of builder objects, for example, in Java to build everything. So everything is done in a certain way, in a repeatable way. Once you sort of get a flavor of how the Google Ads API works in a certain client library, you can expect all the services and all the different methods that you operate with in that client environment to work the same way. And in Java, that leads to some significant time savings. So optimize along the way. And when you get to the Google Ads API, you should have everything sort of migrated onto the new stack using the Google Ads API. Hopefully things will be a little bit more efficient. Your code footprint could be smaller. And the final step, again, is to transition away from the AdWords API and get onto the Google Ads API. So to make this a little bit more concrete, one of the things, here's sort of the different pieces of the puzzle and some of the key tasks broken down into 3 main phases. Well, actually 4, because the first one is sort of a phase 0, and it's not really a proper phase of work, but it's something that you can be doing right now and you could have been doing from the beginning, and we really are trying to get everybody to start doing, and that's just getting familiar with the API. So we're calling that sort of phase 0, and that's sort of your setup for your migration. So plan phase 0. That's something that you can be doing now. Get familiar with the API, make an API call. Move on to phase 1. Phase 1 involves scoping, providing us feedback. We still have a feedback mechanism. Again, this is still a beta, and we want to hear your feedback, and finishing your planning. So in this phase of the project, you want to start evaluating the scope of what you need to do. Again, if you have time and you have things that you want, features, things like that, provide us feedback. Verify feature completeness of the API. Complete a risk assessment. If you have a really large code base, it's really important to know where things could go wrong and plan for that. And finalize a migration plan. And once you move on from that, the second phase, phase 2, is where you actually do the work, right? Migrate logical groups of services, do the coding, get things starting to move from the AdWords API onto the Google Ads API. And doing so will allow you to deploy into a heterogeneous environment. We have both the AdWords API and the Google Ads API running together in a production environment. Again, that's the best way to do this. Don't try to do it all at once. And finally, the sort of third phase here, we put it as its own phase because we really want to make sure that people transition properly. You want to sunset your AdWords API usage. So that means completing the migration of all your components and verifying that you're not actually using the AdWords API anymore. I know that sounds silly, but that has happened when we've worked with developers, for example, just using the normal AdWords API, migrating from version to version, 2018.02, 2018.06. It's not necessarily uncommon to find out you've migrated most of your software, and then we turn off an old version and something breaks because you still had some service or something deployed somewhere that you didn't realize was still making 1 or 2 API calls to an old version of the API. So we want you to really take advantage of the last phase of migration to make sure that you've cut all your ties to the AdWords API and are fully running on the Google Ads API in production. And so just to give you an idea of how this can be planned out over time, we can overlay these phases on top of the migration timeline that we've laid out earlier in the deck. So phase 0, again, that's something that's just making your first API call, getting familiar. That's something that you could have been doing and you can do right now, all the way back even before V04. But I think V04 and the final release of the AdWords API in 2018-09 meant that there weren't any other pending tasks, so you're sort of free to start doing that. And now that we're on V06, again, we have that core set of RMF functionality implemented. You can move on to phase 1. So now you can start scoping and accurately understand what you need to do, how to plan, get resources together. Again, things may still not be fully baked right now. We're still in a beta, like the recommendation service, right? We don't expose all the features yet. The change status service, we may not have all the granular information that we're going to have, but the skeleton is there. Same thing with the RMF features, right? We may not have full parity, but most of it is there. You can understand what it looks like. So now's the time to at least start planning. You can understand the tasks that you have ahead. And then once we get to V1 in Q1 of 2019 and we're actually in production and out of beta, that's where you can actually start writing code. That's when you can start migrating services over from the AdWords API to the Google Ads API piece by piece, and do that in a way that gives you enough time to plan for the third phase of migration, sort of making sure that the cord is cut, that you're completely on the Google Ads API and you don't have any further dependencies on the AdWords API before the sunset comes up. Because it's really important. You do not want to leave this to the very end. So this is sort of how if you wanted to get started right now, again, you don't have to start writing code right now. We're not ready. We're not at that point yet. But here's how you can take these tasks, put them in sort of logical phases, and plan that out over the next year into 2019. Okay, so resources. We're getting to the end here. We're going to get into the Q&A. I know we got a lot of questions, especially that were submitted ahead of time. So hopefully we can get through everything. So I don't want to belabor this point too much for the resources. Just main thing is we have the Google Ads API developer site. That's our main site. And I just want to headline the first resource there, the migration guide. That codifies a lot of what we talked about here, especially in the migration section. We're adding to that pretty consistently. So go back to that. We're going to fill that out with more migration advice. So look to that as sort of your Bible for migrating, and use that as your resource for planning your migration. We have some API platform and protocol buffer stuff. This is mainly documentation if you want to get deep into the weeds about the internals of the Google Ads API and how it works under the covers. But I think the more important thing is the bottom right here, getting support. We have the Google Ads developer blog. That's our main announcement channel. Where, for instance, you found out about this webinar, found out about the versions V06 release a week or so ago. We also have our one-to-many AdWords API support, aka the Google Ads API forum. This is a forum that we have for AdWords support. Now we're using it for the Google Ads API support. Please use that to ask questions. You can answer each other's questions in a forum. We also have our support engineers that monitor it. And finally, we do have dedicated support. So this may be an option that you may not have been aware of. We do have a support alias, AdWords API-support, that you can write into. So if you have technical questions, you're trying to do something with the API, it's not working, trying to get the client library working, if you're running into any sort of issue that you need help, you can't get help on the forum, write into this support alias, and one of our support engineers will get back to you within a day or two and help you directly. So please leverage that if you run into trouble and need some technical support. Okay, about to get into the Q&A. Before I do, I think this is a good place to emphasize that we have a feedback form for for gathering feedback about the API. So if you have questions that aren't necessarily technical questions, they're not, I need help doing this, I need help doing that, I want this client library supported, or I really wish we had more feature support for this. If you have feature requests or you have feedback about the API beta program, we do have a feedback form integrated into the Google Ads API developer site. So the normal feedback mechanism that's on all our developer sites, if you click that send feedback in the upper right, it'll bring up a form that looks like this and has two options. You can either click on the left, that gives you feedback about this actual document, the page. What I'm talking about is on the right, product feedback. If you click that link, you'll be taken to a feedback form. And this is sort of the primary channel that we want to receive feedback from you on, as far as feature requests, what's working, what's not, what you want to see in the Google Ads API. We're in a really good spot to be able to do this because we are still in the beta program. So if you send us feedback via this form, that gives us an idea and a temperature of what's going on out there in the developer ecosystem. So we want to hear from you. So I think a lot of the questions that we're going to try to answer in the Q&A here are also good. I'll try to answer them as best I can, but also I think I'm probably going to point you to the feedback form to make sure that your voice is heard. So please submit that there if you have feature requests and sort of asks for our API engineering team. Okay, so now let's get to the Q&A. I'm going to switch over here. I am going to sort them by the thumb up count, and here we are going to go, and we'll see if we can get through all these. I know there's a lot. I'll do my best. Okay, so the first one. Am I right that if we want to make YouTube video ads, we need to use Google Ads API instead of AdWords API? To upload video, will we need also use the YouTube API? Okay, so if you want to make YouTube video ads, the Google Ads API and the AdWords API don't necessarily have support for YouTube video ads. I know that's something that a lot of people have asked for. Just like the AdWords API doesn't support video ads, out of the box, we don't necessarily have support for video ads in the Google Ads API either. It's a big ask. We know we've heard it a lot. We know that there's a big demand for wanting to manipulate and create like video campaigns, true view campaigns through the Google Ads API. But right now, the Google Ads API is not going to offer support, at least in its version 1.0 iteration that we're going to be releasing in Q1 for video ads either. So it's going to be, you can have the same limitations with the Google Ads API vis-a-vis video ads that you're going to have with the AdWords API. But to speak to your second point, to upload videos to YouTube, yes, the YouTube Content API is a separate API, not necessarily for ads and monetization, but if you do want to upload videos to YouTube, there is a YouTube Content API where you can do so. So unfortunately, you don't have anything to announce as far as YouTube video ads vis-a-vis the Google Ads API. That still can have the same limitation as the current AdWords API. Okay, this is one of the pre-questions that was voted up a bit. When will service accounts be available as an option? So this is one of the ways that you can authenticate with OAuth is instead of using the Webflow or the installed application flow, you can also theoretically use service accounts. This, as it stands, is a limitation in our client libraries, not necessarily the API. So what that means is you can theoretically use service accounts now if you use our RESTful interfaces and don't use our client libraries. So while service accounts are technically supported, we are still working on integrating that support into our client libraries. That is something that we're hoping to have in our client libraries when we get into production. I don't think we'll have it before then because I don't think we're going to have too much more of an iterative releases in the client library or the API before we get to that version 1.0 release. So as far as when, look for that probably Q1 of 2019, around the same time that things go into production for the Google Ads API in general. Okay, any plans to expose all possible recommendations that you currently get through the UI? So yes, this is something I mentioned earlier when we were actually covering the recommendation slides. We are planning on having most of the recommendation. I can't guarantee 100% coverage for every single recommendation type, but I do know that we are planning on expanding that list significantly. So stay tuned for future versions. The current published list of types is definitely not it. It's just the beginning. So we are planning to expand that fairly significantly. So look for that when we get closer to Q1 and production. So are there any performance differences between the two APIs? This is actually a great question, and it's a bit of a loaded question because right now we're in the beta, and I don't think we're quite ready in a position to start talking about benchmarking and the performance comparisons between the two APIs just yet. That being said, we have designed the new Google Ads API, like I said, to have much more um, a much more scalable infrastructure for downloading large amounts of data. We expect things to be a little bit more efficient for how you query the API vis-a-vis the Google Ads query language. So in general, I don't think you can expect there to be very big performance differences. And in general, we've designed the Google Ads API to be scalable. But exactly what that means in performance benchmarking, I don't think we're in a position where we can talk about that. That being said, if you do notice things that are surfacing a very significant performance difference, say you're playing around with the new Google Ads API, you notice the report is taking much longer. Those are things we need to know. We're looking for you to help us debug and surface to us during the beta program. So if you do find places where you do encounter performance differences that are noticeable to you, please do report that to us, either on the API forum or through the feedback form. We want to make sure that we address as much as many things as we can during the beta program and work out the kinks. So in general, we are hoping and we're planning for the Google Ads API to be just as performant, hopefully better, if we can, than the AdWords API. We're not planning to, we don't know of any significant performance differences between the two. But again, please let us know if you do find issues in this area so we can help sort them out in the beta period. Will there be a pro client library for the Google Ads API? That's a great question. We've had some requests for various different libraries. Perl's one of them. We are evaluating different, like I said, when we were talking about client libraries, this isn't necessarily the full static list. We are gauging interest for which client libraries to prioritize and get out there sooner rather than later. So this would be a great thing to report to us on the feedback form, to be quite honest. Make us aware of this. Let us know you're using Perl. Let us know you want it, so that our client library engineering teams can prioritize that and make sure it's on our radar. So for Perl specifically, I don't have an ETA on when a Perl client library may be available, but please use the feedback form for something like this to let us know and sort of lodge your interest so we can make sure we can prioritize that accordingly. There's another one. How can I get the API without Android Studio? So there isn't any inherent dependency on Android Studio or any other IDE or SDK. All of our client libraries are available on GitHub. So you can download them and use them, and even without the client libraries, you can use the API directly from curl on the command line or wget or something like that. It's a RESTful API. So there isn't any inherent dependency on Android Studio or anything else. So just go straight to GitHub, get the client libraries, and use them in any client environment that you'd like to. How quickly do metrics refresh? This is a good question. There's no difference between using the API for fetching metrics and using the Google Ads user interface. So we have sort of data freshness rules that govern how much of a lag there is between, say, when an impression click, whatever comes into the Google Ads system and when it shows up in your account. And those same freshness rules apply to the Google Ads API or AdWords API for that matter. There's no difference because you're using the API. In general, it's 3 hours for most things. So 3 hours after the click or impression occurred, it should show up in the account. But there are some caveats and some things that take a little bit longer. My recommendation is if you go to Google and literally search for Google Ads data freshness, that should surface a Google Ads Help Center article that talks directly about this. And it applies to Google Ads as a product, but there's no difference in how that works with the API. So the same rules that you would see in a Help Center article would apply to your API usage as well. What is the future of conversion types? It seems like a high priority field that is still not available in the beta. So we are doing a little bit. We are still working on exposing the full feature set as far as conversions are going. In the version v06, I think we filled that out a little bit. We have the conversion action service for manipulating conversions. I think one of the areas that's still not quite finished in the current iteration of the beta is reading down some of the conversion data and reading conversion types from that Google Ads query language. But that is in the works, and we will be implementing it. So of note, you can take a look right now. Again, if you go to the conversion action service and look at the conversion action resource in the documentation, you'll notice a whole bunch of fields there. There's one for type. There's also one for category, and those correspond to the generalized conversion type, whether it's like a website, call conversion, and the category I think is like whether it's a purchase, whether it's a lead. So we still are planning on exposing and allowing you to work with a full set of conversion types. I think this is just an area where we need to fill out the API a little bit more because it's in beta, but that is on its way and we're still working on it. Are there any plans to make the change history feature in the API more robust so it emulates? Okay, I think we covered this. we are planning on making the change history feature more robust than it currently is. I can't speak to whether we'll be able to actually provide you the identifier of the user that made the change, but I can confirm that we are working on making it a lot more robust than it currently is. So this would be another good place for the feedback form. Please write us there, help us understand the use case for the identifier of the user that made the change, and just lodge that interest so we can use that when we prioritize our efforts. So yes, there are changes coming there, but I can't necessarily speak to whether the user will be one of them. Okay, are there any plans to make billing issues available through the API? Even if it provided no billing information, it would be great to see what ads weren't running due to a billing issue. So it's actually a great question, and we are exploring ways to do this. I don't know if this is something we'll have in version 1.0 of the Google Ads API, but we are looking into ways, for example, detect whether billing is set up or isn't set up for an account, because obviously if it's not set up, you can do everything you want programmatically with the Google Ads account, and it's like pushing rope, right? Nothing's going to happen. There's no billing information set up. So this is something that we are looking at, but I don't necessarily have an ETA for if and when that may be in the API. Again, this can go back to the feedback form. Please kind of lodge that there so we have a record of this, and we'll so we know. Again, we are working on it, but this will help us prioritize it and know that there is interest out there for that sort of thing. So I just saw in the chat that I'm doing the answering all the questions from the same developer. Like I said, these are questions that were submitted ahead of time. These are all from a whole bunch of different developers. The reason that these are coming from my name is because I pre-populated the form with all the 20 questions or so that was pre-populated. So these are questions that came, again, that's why I put a little pre next to it. So bear with me. These are questions that were submitted ahead of time. Are there any plans to make ad scripts available in the broader Google Apps script environment? So I don't necessarily have anything I could say about Google Ads Script that's a little bit outside of the scope of the webinar and the Google Ads API as a product. I can say that there probably are going to be some changes to Google Ads Script vis-a-vis the Google Ads API migration in general, but we'll have more announcements about that from our Google Apps Script team. So I'm going to park this as not necessarily being something we can answer right here on this webinar. Okay, so what is the correct way to build a selector when using related to query search parameter to pass keyword stats to the API to get stats? Okay, so this one, so I think it sounds like you're talking about using the keyword planner APIs to get stats queries. We do have new keyword planner functionality in the Google Ads API, but the correct way to formulate that query, I'd recommend that you write into AdWords API support at google.com. They can share with you an example of how to an exact, like syntactically correct example of how to formulate this query and help you out. I'm not sure I can answer this one on the webinar right now, but there should be a way to do it. We do have keyword planning services in the Google Ads API that are equivalent to the AdWords API. Okay, so yeah, for this one, please write into AdWords API-support at google.com, and they should be able to help you with an example of how to do this. Okay, next one here, live question. Okay, so getting ahead of the pre-questions here, okay. Will it be possible to download the spend of all accounts in a single request? So that's a good question. So as of right now, I don't believe we have the functionality to do sort of cross-account reporting, right? To issue a request at the MCC level, or excuse me, manager account, now that we've rebranded that product a little bit, and get a whole bunch of accounts all in one request. So right now, I don't think there's going to be any changes in that regard, at least not for version 1.0 of the Google Ads API. But we've noted that, and I think we have thought about ways of trying to expand like manager account reporting, like there is in the manager UI. But I don't think anything like that will be in version 1.0 of the Google Ads API. But this is another great place for feedback. Let us know the use case and what you're trying to do with this, and we can take that back to the product team and see if that's something we may be able to offer in the future. Will it be possible to link client account to MCC account via the API beta? So it should be possible. Yes, I believe it is. So this is something I think we may have added in the last round v06 with the RMF release. Is you should be able to do account linking the same way you do it in the AdWords API, by sending invitations and accepting those invitations. If you have any issues with doing this, do let us know. Again, either ask on the forum or AdWords API support if you have trouble getting this to work or need some more clarification. But yes, this should be possible to do. Is customer service already available to consult accounts via the API beta? So we do have a customer service. We have the customer service and we have the customer client service that allows you to list accounts from a manager account and get all the clients underneath it. So I think I'm not entirely sure what you mean by consult accounts via the API, but we have two services for managing customer accounts. There's a customer service, and equivalent to the old managed customer service in the AdWords API, there's a new service called the customer client service. That's sort of analogous to the manager account. So if you're looking for the services to be able to list manager accounts and things like that, look for both the customer service and the customer client service. And I think most of the account management features that were in the AdWords API should be available now in between using those two services together. So when can we completely migrate to the new API version? I think once we go into version 1.0, so starting Q1 of 2019, I think is when you can start to think about moving your code. And again, plus 1 year from that is when we're planning to sunset. So that's sort of the migration window that we want you to start to work with. How will the rate limits compare to the existing AdWords API? This is actually a great question. We will still have rate limits in place on the AdWords API and the Google Ads API. So in general, the rate limits should be comparable. One of the interesting things about the Google Ads API is we're going to have actually pretty strong rate limits, stronger than you would expect, on GET requests. So like we're doing a campaign service.get, because we expect you to use that unified query language, that SQL query language. Again, because it's a RESTful API, you could theoretically, instead of doing a select campaign or select names and stuff from campaign to get all the campaigns, you can theoretically just call the campaign service and get one campaign at a time. One of the things we are going to limit pretty heavily is the use of those GET methods, because we want you to use the unified query language. Again, it's designed for high performance and throughput and to be a scalable reporting mechanism. But in general, how the rate limits compare, they will be comparable, and we don't necessarily have any changes to announce in how we're going to be rate limiting vis-a-vis, for example, basic access or standard access with a developer token with the new Google Ads API. All those restrictions should still be in place. How is change status different from customer sync service in the AdWords API? So they're very similar, but the customer sync service in the AdWords API was very, very broad and didn't give you much in the way of granularity. The change status service in the Google Ads API is made to mimic the change history in the Google Ads UI a lot more closely. So in general, they serve the same purpose, right? It's for getting changes to a customer, but the change status is essentially tracking much more closely the change history. And like I said, we're working on making that a little bit more granular as time goes on. So again, customer sync service in the AdWords API, you can't get things like what actually changed, what values changed, when it changed, things like that. You just sort of get an object changed, and that's all you know. And it's very granular, like a customer change, a campaign change, or an ad group change. That's about it. Change status, we're planning on going much deeper. Let me see. I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to make sure I get to some of the live questions before going back to any of the pre-submitted ones, because we still have a bunch to work through here. So how can we create a smart shopping or shopping campaign goal optimized? So we do have support in the Google Ads API for both shopping campaigns and the new smart shopping campaigns, or what were called shopping campaigns goal optimized. The product changed names a few times. So we do have support in the Google Ads API. You can create both types of campaigns. I think we have code examples out, or we'll have code examples very shortly on how to do so. So look in our code examples for examples on how to create a shopping campaign or a smart shopping campaign. We should have that out. If you need more assistance on doing this, either right into the forum or the AdWords API support, we can give you an example of how to do that. But it is possible. You create them just like normal campaigns, very similar to how you created them in the AdWords API. They're just normal campaign objects with the shopping settings set properly. Okay. Let's see. Go on to any plan to build a Node.js client library? Again, this sort of goes back to the same thing with the Perl library. We're evaluating a whole bunch of different options. Let us know via the feedback form if you want to if you have specific needs for Node.js. So we have one here about YouTube campaigns. I think we answered that already. Node support, answered that one already. So would it be possible to manage users with the new Google Ads API? So it will be possible to manage users like in an MCC or manage your customer settings the same as you can manage them with the AdWords API. So yes, it is possible to manage users in general the same way you can manage them with the AdWords API and the Google Ads API. If you have anything more specific, let us know on the forum, and we can point you in the right direction for what functionality you might be looking for. Okay, so I think we've covered most everything. I will try to let me see if there's anything we haven't answered yet. I think we've gotten covered most everything here. A couple pre-submitted questions we can get to here. Is an equivalent of the shopping performance report planned? So yes, well, right now we don't necessarily have shopping performance exposed in the current beta of the API. We know that it's important. We know that people use the shopping performance report in the AdWords API, and we're actively working on exposing that in the new Google Ads API. So it's not necessarily available right now in the current beta, but we're actively working on getting the same metrics exposed to you in the Google Ads API. Okay, this is actually a great one. So we just started out with the Google AdWords API. Would you recommend switch to the Google Ads API first before continuing with the next implementation, or should we continue with the Google AdWords API? What are the pros and cons? So this is actually a great question, right? If you're in software development right now, what do you do? And I think this really depends on whether you have if you've already started coding, if you've already have a significant amount invested in the AdWords API, please keep going. So it's like if you already started swimming, keep swimming, get to the other side. Be aware though that you will have a migration coming up and you will need to port this code in the next +1 year. So if you're still in the planning stages of an API integration, I think that this comes down to whether you're planning to be in production before or shortly after Q1 of 2019. So again, assuming that we get the Google Ads API into production in Q1 of 2019, if that's good enough for you, if you're planning on releasing in end of Q1, Q2, it might be a good idea to start thinking about the Google Ads API, or like I was saying before, at least implement some of your features in the Google Ads API, and maybe some things that, for example, are still need to be fleshed out in the beta on the AdWords API. So I think if you're in flux and you're targeting right around the release date, unless you have fairly high confidence that you can you have some wiggle room in your deployment schedule and can wait till we get version 1.0 out the door. If you're pressed for time, I would still recommend using the AdWords API, because we don't necessarily want people starting to build production systems and starting running up against production deadlines using the AdWords API. Using the Google Ads API beta, because again, it still is a beta. There's still kinks we have to work out, and we don't want you to be stuck in a situation where you're waiting until all the way until Q1 2019 in order for us to fix those things, and you block your product launch. So I think it's very much dependent on where you are in your software development. So if you can wait for the Google Ads API and your launch timing is sensitive to getting out to the end of Q1 or Q2, then you may be able to wait for the Google Ads API. But if you're resource constrained, or you're targeting somewhere in Q1 or have started working, I would strongly suggest still using the AdWords API, because it won't block your project plans. Okay, let's see. Did we cover everything? Anything else going on? So I think that covers most everything. Any plans to make campaign goal available to the API? So this is one of the campaign goals. This is something in the UI when you create a campaign. You get some visual cues to whether the point of your campaign is to create user interface, whether the point of your campaign is to drive website traffic, drive purchases, something like that. We don't necessarily have plans to expose these in the API, because primarily these are guides for the user interface to configure the Google Ads UI to show you the relevant features for the goal that you're trying to optimize for. On the back end, right, you're still creating a search campaign or a display campaign or whatever, a shopping campaign. It doesn't necessarily change the underlying back-end objects that you're dealing with. But at the same time, we understand that if somebody has selected that in the Google Ads UI, it can be important for an API user and a tool to know what the preferences are of the user. So I don't think we have any plans, at least for the version 1.0, to expose this. But this is another one I recommend sending us this request via the feedback form so we can prioritize this, see if it makes sense to release these sort of UI-centric features in a future version of the API. Okay, let's see. Scrolling through the list to see if we get anything more. So that's the campaign goals. Okay, we've got a few more here. Pre-submitted questions. I'm just looking to see if we have any live questions. I want to make sure I didn't. Okay, I got some at the bottom. So this is the question before about retrieving the customers via the API. So you're talking about retrieving all users connected. So if you're trying to get a list of all users that are connected in an MCC hierarchy, for instance, in a manager hierarchy, like going back to that campaign diagram we had in the logging customer ID section, we do have a way for you to retrieve that data. Yes, you can issue a Google Ads query language request to the client customer resource, and that will fetch you the list, the entire MCC tree, the entire manager customer hierarchy. So we do have a way using the Google Ads query language where, yes, you can get all the connected users in a manager hierarchy via the API. So that comes from the customer client resource and using the customer client fields in the Google Ads query language. How can I get campaign data from an account that doesn't link with our MCC? Okay, it's a good question. You absolutely can do that. So you can work with the Google Ads API, just like you work with the Ads API, with accounts that aren't in your MCC. And to do that, you need their credentials. So you use OAuth to get the credentials of a user that has access to that account. So if you build a product, for instance, a portal that you ask a user to log into, you use Google OAuth to ask for their credentials and authorize them to give you access to their Google Ads account. And if you do that, you can use those credentials to make API calls to target that client account, irrespective of whether it's in a manager account or not. So you can get campaign data from an account that's not linked with an MCC, but you do need its credentials, and you can get that and integrate that in your tool by using the OAuth flow and asking the owner of the account to give your tool or your platform permission to access the account, and in that way you can use you can use OAuth credentials to access campaigns that aren't in an MCC. Okay, last one here, and then I think we're out of time. We are planning to integrate mutate calls in early January. Should we wait for 1.0 or use the release beta version? So if you're planning to integrate mutate calls in early January, I think we're likely, if we do release the 1.0 in Q1, it will probably be at least late January, not necessarily early January. And if you're planning to integrate mutate calls, I would so if you're trying to do this in a production environment and you want it to be dependable and outside of prototyping, this sounds pretty close. I would wait to the 1.0 version because you don't necessarily want to integrate with something in early January that's still in the beta. So unless this is for a prototype or a beta product itself where you're testing things out, if you're trying to integrate with the Google Ads API in a production environment, and you're really close to when we're probably going 1.0, my recommendation would be to wait. But again, you might want to get in touch with us either on the forum or reach out to Google Ads API support. For if you have any more specifics on your plans, we can guide you a little bit better. But it's going to be really close to 1.0, and you might want to avoid integrating with the beta if you can, if you're going to be close to sort of the production release of the Google Ads API. Okie doke, I think we've got through pretty much everything. So I am going to call it. It's been over an hour. So thank you guys very much. I apologize for the technical difficulties when we got started, but I hope this was helpful. And hopefully we'll see everybody on a future version of the webinar once we get closer to the release date or shortly after the production. Thank you very much.